Hey everybody, it's Chuck Dixon back to answer questions about what I do for a living and what I do for a living as I write comic books. Crazy, huh? Let's get to the questions. Charles Santino says, if you do another Ask Chuck, here's a question I asked at a pro after con dinner. What's the dumbest thing an editor ever said to you? My favorite answer from a writer who pitched a Batman story, the editor said the plot twist was a cliche and we don't do cliches at DC. Oh my, I could, you know, I'm going to revisit this question because I keep thinking of new ones. Okay, this one wasn't said to me. Let's save that until we need a home run. This one wasn't said to me. It was said to another writer who's a friend of mine who pitched an awesome crossover idea, like company crossover or title crossover idea at DC Comics. And the editor said, let's save that until we need a home run. Has anyone ever said that? Does that make any sense at all? Aren't home runs always desirable? It's like saying, let's save that till we need an orgasm. Let's not do that until it's profitable. Yeah, this is the kind of stuff you run into. Instead of just saying no, because editors are a cowardly lot, a lot of them, they glad hand you. They lead you on. So instead of just saying, I don't like that, it sucks, and I don't want to do it, they come up with phrases like this. My other favorite is, we're doing a project almost exactly like this right now. And it's never true, but they say it anyway, because it's a nice way of letting you down. And then you're not mad at them. Okay, we don't want this to be more of a cash grab than it already is. This is another one at DC, and this one was said to me. I did a mini series which was at the core of a company crossover. And instead of just publishing a 6-issue miniseries, they decided to make it a 5-issue miniseries and put the first issue story into some sort of a special. So they got 2 number ones out of it. And I said to the editor, well, you have to make sure in the solicits that readers understand that they have to buy this special in order to understand the rest of the story, because the special basically sets the miniseries up. And his answer was, we don't want this to be more of a cash grab than it already is. So in other words, you'd rather the readers didn't know they were missing the first part of the story than shamelessly ask them to buy your product. You run into this a lot sometimes with editors. They don't seem to understand that publishing is a business. You're supposed to make money. There's nothing shameful about it. Okay, this is the top of the heap. I'm going to think of more, but this is absolutely the top of the heap. I promise. The dumbest thing I've ever heard anybody say. And this wasn't a comic book editor; it was a children's book editor. I presented a book about robots, and it would just be like a fanciful kids book, picture book about robots. Robots doing zany stuff. The year was 1977, and this guy said, "We're not doing that because kids don't like robots." Now, the punchline to this one is, this is the magazine that was sitting right on his desk in plain view at the time. Well, then what's that, bozo? Kids don't like, kids don't like robots. What kid doesn't like robots? Okay, here's another dumb one. I was working on G.I. Joe, and it wasn't at IDW. And my editor and the publisher as well didn't seem to understand the franchise at all. At one point, they told me that the idea of a worldwide terrorist conspiracy bent on dominating the planet was an idea they wanted to get away from because it wasn't realistic. This is like, shortly after 9/11. So anyway, I was told that the Cobra Rattler was too science fiction-y for this series. They were trying to get away from the science fiction-y elements of G.I. Joe. This is the Cobra Rattler. Wow, look at that. Cool plane, right? And it looks almost exactly like the A-10 Warthog in use by the Army and the Marines, and I believe the Navy as well, and had been in use for 20 years before this editor told me that the almost identical Cobra airplane was too science fiction-y. All right, let's leave the editors alone for a while. and go over to another question. Leonard Pig says, what is your writing process like? Is there a certain set of rituals when undertaking the task? Um, Coffee and then sitting. That's my process. I kind of write till I'm done writing, and that's hard to tell. It's hard to say I'm done for the day because you think I could do a little bit more, or, but you don't. Especially in some stories, you don't want to push it. You know, a tip I always use at the end of the day is to not write down my last thoughts. That way, I know where I'm going to begin the following day. That's an old, you know, adage or piece of advice that I read from a screenwriter from the golden age of Hollywood, and it works. But my process is, the actual writing process, the actual sitting down and writing, is really a small part of it. The rest of it is walking around all the time with these crazy ideas in my head and trying to work out, how do I dramatize them? How do I make them believable? How do I put them in a story? Whatever. And often it's not even my own ideas. Sometimes other people put crazy ideas in my head, like, Richard Meyer or Box Day. They put the most insane ideas in my head, and then it's a challenge. I've got to make them work. And of course, you've got to populate those ideas with situations and characters and dialogue and all the rest. But yeah, the process is a messy one. And I try to limit it to 5 days a week, although, over the weekends, I'm thinking about the stuff anyway. But yeah, it takes place, my process, quote unquote, takes place mostly in my head. Rick Garcia says, if you were hired to be the main editor of the Batman titles, what would be the first thing you would do? Wow. That's a big question. The first thing I would do is I would remove the onus of uh, Return of the Dark Knight and Batman Year One as well. This is a huge mistake. The projects weren't a mistake. The projects are, both those projects are worthy and certainly were game changers and certainly created a lot of terrific exploitable content for DC Comics, and fans liked them. The mistake DC made is in setting them as the alpha and omega of anything Batman. Excuse me. Anything Batman from this point on was deemed to be inferior, that this was the high watermark. Frank Miller's work on these two titles were it. The be all, end all. Nobody would ever do a story this good again. And that's an enormous mistake because first of all, you're refusing to recognize work that is either equal or superior to it that followed. And I'm not claiming to have done any of that, but I'm saying, you set the bar, you've set this imaginary bar. And I've seen Batman projects that were as good or better than those that came after, but they were never recognized as such. And even just from a strictly marketing standpoint, do you really want to say our best work is behind us? Our best work is from 30, 35 years ago, and everything now is crap in comparison? Do you really want to say that? I mean, did MGM say we can't do better than Gone with the Wind and then just give up? No. And the thing is, I mean, I ran headlong into this where, I've never been an artiste, an auteur. I've never had any aspirations to pretension. I've never sought an Eisner Award. But when I did Robin Year One with Scott Beatty and Javier Polito, we wanted it marketed and even the trade dress to be similar to Batman Year One. The idea being, as I presented it to the editor, it would sit on the same shelf next to it, and it would help it in sales if you were to, positively compare it to Batman Year One. Don't say it's its equal. Don't say it's better. We don't want to say superior, but at least tell the readers, hey, we'd like to do a whole shelf of these things. And, Year One books, this tidy little library, and Batman Year One was the first, and we're going to do more. And I was, met with indifference. They couldn't see that they had basically cut themselves off the ankles marketing wise. when it came to Batman. Watchmen is another one. There will never be a better superhero story. Well, of course, there's been equal to or better superhero stories since then. Watchmen had a crappy ending. Um, I've seen better stuff. So that's one thing I would change. I would get rid of that notion that we can't do better or that we haven't done better. The other thing I would return to, it's very, very simple. And I had to go to Lego for a picture like this. The classic Batman villains, bring them back, use them in rotation, use them frequently, and use them correctly. Present them in their classic form because readers dig it. The last really big Batman hit was Hush. And, one of the secrets behind Hush is they marketed the hell out of it. But the other thing was it had every major Batman villain in it. It's like whenever they do Justice League and it's a hit because it's got all the major characters in it. And they're like, oh, Justice League is back and everybody loves it again because it's got, Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and Flash and Green Lantern and Aquaman and Martian Manhunter in it. Yeah, they've got, the Magnificent Seven. They're top characters all in one book. Sells well. And then, down the line, the writers and editors decide, well, let's put in new characters. and then the sales begin to plummet. And they always wonder why. It's because readers like the classic characters and they like to see them well presented and they like to see them mixing it up. It's as simple as that. So I would bring back the Batman villains, put them in regular rotation and challenge the writers to, come up with new angles, work within the framework of the classic character, but come up with new angles, new stories, new heists, new things that they get into. And there you go. I would also spend a lot of time on Gotham City. I did this when I was on the Bat books. I categorized things. I created settings that we could return to over and over again. I tried to create an air of familiarity with the reader to Gotham as if they felt like they had visited it. Really canonizing everything, names of bridges, rivers, inlets, sounds, businesses, streets, and avenues. In Bloodhaven, a city I created from the ground up, I named all of the cross streets. The avenues were named for whaling terms because Bloodhaven was a whaling city, and the streets were named for hard-boiled fiction writers. So you might have, Woolwich and Baleen would be a intersection. And I did a lot of that kind of stuff in Gotham, and I think it really helps the readers. And I would return to that and I would emphasize that and try to create some consistency because, well, back when I was on the titles, I was working with Alan Grant and Doug Mensch, and we didn't have a problem with consistency because we were all on the same page. One of the freakiest things that ever happened was we were at a summit and we were discussing something surrounding the grandfather clock that's the entrance to the Batcave. And one of the editors said something about, and the character, comes from this room, and surprises someone by the clock. And it's really weird because Doug and Alan and I almost simultaneously said, no, they couldn't come from that room because that hallway leads from the kitchen. Now, there had never been any layouts or schematics or whatever, but for some reason, the three of us in our minds separately had created an image of the Wayne Manor, a schematic, a blueprint of the Wayne Manor that was identical on the first floor, that the watchtower is adjacent to the kitchen. Isn't that weird? I think that's very weird. The editors were kind of speechless at that one. The other thing I would do is I would make the police more consistent, Gordon and all the cops that support him. Make sure there's a consistency there in police procedure and the way they operate. When I was on Batman, I had a particular pair of detectives who were homicide detectives. And, I shamelessly ripped them off from Ed McBain's 87th Precinct series. But they were these, two cops who would show up at every crime scene, every homicide crime scene. And so things like that, even down to uniform cops, consistency in the look of the police, look of police cars, what weaponry they use, things like that, just to make, as I said, things seem more familiar. Also, I'd carve out a few sidekicks. I'd send them somewhere else. Yeah, I know I'm guilty. I brought back Robin. I created Spoiler, kind of in the Bat family. and I brought back the Huntress. I brought Huntress into the main Batman um, cast of characters. But, you know, in both Spoiler and Huntress's case, they were created as sort of rival vigilantes to Batman. But now Batman, you know, the tortured loner has a whole crowd of people. One of these, I don't even know who he is. This whole crowd of people that, you know, this little army, his own police force. And I think it's got to be trimmed down. You know, it's one of the reasons we got Nightwing out of Gotham, was to sort of pare the cast down. Okay, next question. How did the Dean Koontz Frankenstein comics come about, and how involved, if at all, was Koontz in the project? Um, well, Dynamite asked me if I wanted to do these comic book adaptations of Koontz's Frankenstein series. And I said, well, let me take a look. And I took a look, and they were like perfectly adaptable to comics. I mean, they practically were comic scripts written in prose, because he would have action, plot development, action, plot development, action, plot development. There was always things going on. They were absolutely a dream to adapt to comics, absolutely perfect. And his dialogue was even kind of comic bookish. Here's a peek at them. And how involved was he? He read over the scripts, but he never had a problem with anything I did. In fact, I had to write a brand new story. It was like a short story. I can't remember for what reason, some sort of a bonus thing. And he basically said, you know, Chuck gets it. Just let him write whatever he wants. So, you know, thank you, Mr. Koontz, for the trust. But yeah, that's how it came about. I was asked to do it, and I did it. Here we go. Robert Hinman, what was your favorite Savage Sword story to write? It was The Fury of the Iron Damsels. Somehow, Gary Quapis and I knew this was our swan song on Savage Sword. I don't know how we knew, because we were fired by omission, as editors often do, because they don't have the cojones to actually fire you, be a grown-up adult person and fire you. They just sort of stop returning your phone calls. So I think while we were working on this, or while I was writing it, I just wasn't hearing any phone calls back. And I told Gary, I think we might have been fired. So we decided we were just going to put it all in here. So we brought back the Iron Damsels, a cast of female characters that Gary had created a while before, and we threw Red Sonja into the mix as well. So it was Conan and all the gals going on a wild and crazy adventure. And you know, I put a lot into the script, and it was a very demanding script. There's a lot of insane detail in here, but Gary wanted it. He was begging for it. And you know, Gary did some awesome work on Savage Sword, but this really was, you know, the top of the heap. This was his magnum opus, and all kinds of details in environment and the rest of it. And I mean, it's just an eye candy story from beginning to end. And one of the most amazing things about it was this incredible, like, whitewater boat chase in it, that goes on for a number of pages. And Gary's just perfectly blocked out action set piece. Just wonderful stuff. So that was my favorite, the Return of the Iron Damsels. Michael Hutchison, having missed DC's New 52 and Rebirth, if DC ever did another full reboot, what character would you take on? Well, I didn't really miss the New 52, if you know what I mean. Uh, yeah, I'm glad I didn't participate in any of that. And I don't know what character I would have wanted to take on in that mess, because it was also micromanaged. And I don't work well under micromanagement. And also, New 52 would have done a lot better if they just given it to 52 different creative teams and let them run wild. I guarantee you they would have had 6 breakout hits if they just let the creators go nuts and not worry about the uber stories and overarching continuities and things like that. Just find 52 sets of creators that you trust and let them run with it. And the enthusiasm level alone would have translated to the readers, instead of trying to manage it. Today, would you still put in that picture of Reagan on the dictator's wall? Okay, Lou is referring to Airboy #2, one of my first published comic books. And in it, there's a villain. He's a Central American dictator. And Tom Yates thought it would be really funny to put a congratulatory photograph of Reagan in the background. At the time, the Iran-Contra controversy was going on, accusing Ronald Reagan of unlawfully funding the Contras in El Salvador, who were fighting the communists at the time. And Tom decided to put this in there because Tom's, well, way more to the left than I am. I'm way more to the right of Ronald Reagan. So the funny thing about it was, because it was Eclipse Comics, a company run by communists, the readers assumed I was one as well, and that I was responsible for this. And this wasn't in the script. This was Tom ad-libbing. And so we got all these letters accusing me of being a pinko, which I found amusing. Yeah, I didn't put it in then. I would not put it in today. And there you have it. Thank you, Lou. Philip Gregory, who was your favorite artist to work with? Do you take into account your artist, or do you just write and leave it up to them to interpret your script? I tailor my stuff to the artist. I like to know who the artist is going to be. I at least like to see some samples, even if it's a new guy I've never worked with before. And I try to, draw what they're good at, because why not? If they're good at something, it means they like drawing it. So I'm going to lean into that. I've even asked artists, what do you like to draw? What do you not like to draw? And a lot of times the answer is very surprising, because some guys are very good at drawing things, and then you find out they hate drawing that. So I shouldn't even answer this question, but I'm going to. And I'm going to leave somebody out, but I'm going to head in anyway. I've worked with a lot of great artists, and here's a few. As I said before, Gary Quapis, he's my most frequent collaborator. We still collaborate to this day on a weekly comic strip at EggyRiceBurrows.com called Pellucidar. And Gary's just all around terrific artist. Any wacky, nutty thing I ask him to draw, he draws and asks for seconds. And he's a tremendous cartoonist as well. If you ever look at our Right Ho Jeeves adaptation of P.G. Woodhouse's classic novel. But he's most frequent collaborator. Second most frequent collaborator is Graham Nolan. Graham is, again, another guy, fantastic comic artist, fantastic cartoonist, in the classic mode of comic book guys, what they call old school, but what I call really, really good. There's no better comic craftsman working today. And he and I have had a tremendous working relationship over the years, creating this guy, as well as a long run of Detective and various other projects like Joe Frankenstein and the upcoming Expendables Go to Hell graphic novel. So next up would be Flint Henry, my buddy Flint. Flinty inspires me to write my nuttiest stuff, my craziest stuff. This is a little detail from a comic we did called Law Dog. Just a good pal, and yeah, an inspiration to me all the time. The guy's got so much mojo. It just makes me, I don't know, use the wrong part of my brain. I don't know, but I always love working with Flint. Sergio Cariello. I'm showing Sergio here inking his own work. Well, he'll get that. Sergio, we worked at CrossGen together. We worked at DC Comics together. We worked on the Iron Ghost together. And another guy, just all around comic books craftsman. He knows how to do it all. Former instructor at the Joe Kubert School. He's a renaissance man of comics. He can do it all, and do it all well. Rodolfo DiMaggio, one of the most natural talents I've ever worked with, who unfortunately comics lost to Hollywood. So he went out there for the big money, and I can't blame him, but we got to do some incredible stuff together. And I said before, I always ask an artist what they'd like to draw. I asked Rodolfo what he likes to draw, and he said assault helicopters. And I said, marry me. So, but yeah, just an incredible draftsman, incredible talent, amazing storytelling ability. And I treasure everything we got to do together at Well, DC Comics. That's the only place we worked together. Eduardo Barreto, another guy, just a great guy. Uh, the artist when I couldn't get Graham, the artist I most often asked for. It got to be a joke around the DC offices that I requested Eduardo so many times, and I just think I just love the bravura style, the way he makes these fantastic characters look believable. There's texture, everything. The guy's just an all rounder, and just fantastic to work with. Scott McDaniel, I was aware of Scott McDaniel, but it wasn't really until he and I were paired on Nightwing that I began to pay attention to him. And if there's a more kinetic comic artist working out there, I don't know it. I've never heard of the guy. And because he was, he has a degree in engineering, his backgrounds were not only awesome, but they were wild. I mean, this guy could do 23 points of perspective without, breaking a sweat. Just those insane, dizzying angles on a printed page, and and again another nice guy. Every one of these guys I've mentioned so far, they're so self-effacing about their talent. There's no egos, and that's why this guy's, Butch Guys, he has to be next after I say that because he's the most self-effacing guy you'd ever want to meet. He's just, you know, um, and and a terrific collaborator, a guy with a million ideas. It's just fun to sit and blue sky with him. I can't tell you how many miniseries and graphic novels he and I have basically talked out, over dinner or over lunch. Um, and one of the guys I got to work with at CrossGen. Well, actually, I never got to work with him at CrossGen. We sort of hung out a lot together, but he was on another book. But we did Birds of Prey together, um, Storming Paradise, and again, he's another contributor to the upcoming Expendables graphic novel. Another guy I worked with at CrossGen, Steve Epting. Again, another self-effacing guy. Another artist who's not impressed with himself, though they have every right to be. And Steve and I worked on Crux, which was a forgettable book, except that it looked gorgeous because of Steve's work. And it and then El Cazador, the pirate book, which just absolutely beautiful work. He put a lot of time into that book, and it shows. Will Rosado is another guy. He worked with me on Green Arrow, worked with me quite a bit on GI Joe. Just a tremendous talent, tremendous craftsman. I mean, look at that. Look at that. That stuff's that page is so lively and so beautifully drawn. A lot of times when artists are this good, the work gets stiff. Not Will. Will is a tremendous comic book talent, and I've always enjoyed working with him. Although I don't think we've ever met in person. Hilary Barta. We worked on The Simpsons and SpongeBob SquarePants together, and he's probably one of the guys. He's like a contemporary, a peer. I've probably known him. He's one of the guys I've known the longest in the business because we used to run into each other at the Chicago Comic Convention, which for a long time was the comic book convention. And I love working with him, on the humor stuff because he's an amazing cartoonist and he just brings it all. He's very conscientious, and yeah, he knows what he's doing. He brings the funny. A lot of times I just set him up, and his visuals are what really you know, made for the laughs. Um, and I look forward to working with him again, although I don't know on what because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of humor books out there in the mainstream. But yeah, terrific talent, absolutely terrific talent. Staz Johnson. Staz is a guy I worked with quite a bit on Robin and Detective, and he was kind of a utility guy. Uh, if we were between regular artists, Staz would step in. Although I think he was on Robin for quite a few issues. And you can see here just a terrific drawing style. And he brought I hate the word gritty, but he brought a level of realism to like urban type stories. And he's doing a lot of stuff on 2000 AD. He's so suited for that stuff. But yeah, huge talent. And again, another guy would draw any wacky thing I asked him to draw. I worked with a lot of, well, Joe Staten on Guy Gardner. We worked on a few other things together here and there, a couple of Batman projects. And I just like working with Joe. Terrific cartoonist, a real comic book guy. You know what I mean? Um, there's just lots of energy. And again, another guy, just a sweet guy to deal with. Jim Aparo, speaking of sweet, one of the most gentlemanly guys you'd ever want to meet. An older pro from another generation, kind of, I don't know, comic book workhorse. And I don't mean that in a hacking way. I mean, this guy would just put in the hours, but that's all he did. His whole life wasn't comics. He mostly wanted to spend time with his grandkids. He put in the time to do awesome work on Batman and other titles. And he and I got to work together quite a bit on, different arcs, and did a lot of inventory books together. Because even after he retired, he kept his hand in a little bit. I would write inventory issues for him for Detective and Batman. And, they had like open deadlines. He could do them at his leisure. I think we did like 3 or 4 of them. And I don't think any of them ever saw print. Russ East is another one, kind of an idol of mine. When I first worked with Russ, my editor told me he had some questions about the script. It took me 3 days to work up the guts to call him on the phone. And of course, Russ was never very gracious about things like that. Every time I would talk to him, I would have to reintroduce myself, even though we worked together quite a bit. He either was busting my balls or did forget who I was. And why should you remember a comic book writer? I'm sure he had his share of problems with them. But we got to work together quite a bit. One Sergeant Rock story, I wrote his last Haunted Tank story. We did various things here and there, issues of Moon Knight, issues of the Nam, a run on the Punisher, 5-issue run on the Punisher. And there's no, when you want realistic, when you want cinematic, for me, there was just simply nobody better than Russ. Joe Kubert, another idol of mine that I actually got to work with on the Punisher. I'd met Joe years and years earlier when I was invited to the Joe Kubert School for a reunion, even though I wasn't a member. I was friends with so many members that they invited me as well. And Joe is unique in the comic book industry that, my God, he was at it for 65, 70 years, and the work always looked fresh. The guy never went stale. He was always learning. It's just one of the, most unique, idiosyncratic, but natural artists ever to work in the business. Speaking of natural artists, for my money, nobody was a more natural artist than John Buscema, who I got to work with on a couple of Westerns and a run on Punisher. And this guy could just draw like nobody else. Just amazing stuff. I mean, just a natural ability. He made it look easy. It made it look like he didn't sweat. This guy would do layouts. If you ever get a chance to see his layouts, it looks like there's nothing there. But they would hire inkers who understood what they were looking at. And when they were done, it looked like John Buscema. It didn't look like John Buscema in the layouts, but when they were done inking, it did. Because he was such a workhorse, because he was so much in demand, he didn't often do full pencils. Well, here he's penciling and inking himself, but didn't often do full pencils. They just basically relied on him to crank stuff out to meet deadlines. And even then, this stuff is amazing. And when left to his own devices, he was a tremendous Imagineer. Came up with amazing visuals for his stories. John Severin is another guy I was fortunate enough to work with. My first time at Marvel, did a number of Westerns with him. And boy, he brings an authenticity to the work that no one else can touch. No one else. And I think I spoke to him on the phone one time, and I probably, jabbered like an idiot. But he called me. He had again another reference question, and but yeah, just a tremendous talent. And then we move on to my Argentinos amigos. I've made friends with a lot of artists from Buenos Aires. I went down there and visited them for a whole month back in 1987, 1988. I can't remember which. Premier amongst them for me, and my most frequent Argentine collaborator was Enrique Villagran, a Speedy Enrique, Sierra Gomez. So I loved Enrique. He was just a funny, funny guy. and his English was so precise that sometimes he it would take him a while to put a sentence together because he wanted it absolutely precise when he said it. And boy, he's just so fast with artwork. This guy just, crushed deadlines like no other artist I've ever worked with. And Denny O'Neil actually complimented. He's the only time I've ever heard him compliment an artist. He complimented him on a Robin annual that we did together, set in the samurai era. And Denny told me how impressed he was with how it turned out. Jorge Zafino, who I've spoken of many times before. Jorge was a certifiable genius. He was sort of a young Turk at the Villagran Studios in Buenos Aires, and he and I, got to work together quite a bit on Winter World, Seven Block, a Punisher graphic novel, an issue of Savage Sword of Conan. Just an amazing, amazing talent. I miss him every day. Lito Fernandez, Angel Fernandez. This guy draws, obviously in a retro Frank Robbins kind of style that every time we work together, I just lean into. You know, just there's something about his work that screams like 1950s, Sunday newspaper comic strip. And I love working with the guy. We have an unpublished issue of Birds of Prey that was written and drawn as Sunday comic strips from the 1940s, and it recasts Black Canary and Batgirl as World War II aviators. And unfortunately, it's never seen the light of day. If you go to chuckdixon.net, you can see it, but it's never been published. And just a remarkable piece of work. And then my last Argentino amigo is Kike Alcatena. Kike Alcatena, there's no genre this guy can't conquer. He's got kind of an idiosyncratic style, but it morphs. He changes. He adapts to whatever. If it's Batman or a historical period piece or his favorite area, mythology. We've worked on Conan, Batman, Predator, all these different things, and he always does an incredible job. I love working with Kike. And that's it. Now I know I left off a bunch of people. Ron Wagner, Sal Valuto, Kevin West. There's so many great guys I work with. I've been very blessed in my career to work with incredible talents. Okay, so Drew Geraci, my buddy Drewby, shouting down from Atlanta. He's got a question. What is your favorite pop rock music act, and what is your favorite pop rock song? Doesn't have to be from the same act. Well, it is, and they are, and whatever. Drew already knows the answer to this question. My favorite group is the Kinks, and I just like them because they were storytellers. Their songs always had a story, a point of view. They weren't always "I love you, I love you, I love you" songs. They would deal with basically a lot of middle class problems. Uh, you know, not being able to afford gas, or not being particularly good looking, or being able to dance. Um, deal with loneliness and frustration, not being able to get a job. They wrote a bunch of songs about that, which in the 70s were practically anthems to me. And are they the greatest rock and roll group of all time? No, that would be the Rolling Stones. But the Kinks are my favorite for that reason. I mean, Ray Davies composed songs that were meant to be sing-alongs at his local, and that's the way he wrote. Kind of rock and roll passed through a music hall tradition, and they'll always be my favorite group. And my favorite song, Waterloo Sunset, is my favorite rock and roll pop song. It's got it's wistful and sounds kind of happy, but when you listen to it a number of times and really pay attention to lyrics, it's deeply, deeply sad song about a guy who's basically given up the girl he loves, and is so removed, so much in denial that he's actually happy for her and the guy she took off with. And it's just an amazing song that creates a lot of visuals in your mind. I mean, I've never seen a Waterloo sunset, but I think I've imagined one because of this song. And that's about it. Unauthorized TV. There's lots of videos like this go into depth, single subject videos that go into more depth on a lot of the subjects I've been asked questions about here. So check it out. It's a subscription service, but there's a lot of other good stuff on the channel you might want to check out. There's a gardening how-to. There's Owen Benjamin, who's freaking hilarious, stand-up comic, who has, my God, I think hundreds of videos on there. So come by, check it out, and I will see you down the road.